I was standing in a room full of guests when my mother-in-law said that I had just made a baby for profit. And then everything exploded. Last Saturday, Jake and I threw together a small celebration at our apartment in Seattle. Not one of those big, glittering parties with decorations and noise, but a quiet, meaningful evening with the few people who matter most. It still feels surreal to even say this out loud, but I'm pregnant. Unexpectedly, wonderfully, terrifyingly pregnant. And even though the news had barely started to settle into our bones, Jake insisted we mark the moment with something, anything, just to acknowledge the enormity of what was beginning. I think he could see it in my face, how the waves of emotion kept crashing in, one after another, joy tangled up with fear, all wrapped in this strange new reality I was still trying to process. We didn't plan much. Jake lit the candles in the kitchen that we usually save for power outages, and I made a soft playlist that looped through songs we both loved. He brought home a small cake from the bakery near the corner, the same one where we sometimes wander on slow Sunday mornings, and we cleared off the cluttered coffee table to make room for snacks, mocktails, and mismatched wine glasses filled with sparkling water. It was just us, a couple of close friends, and the closest thing to family we have in the city. A few hugs, warm congratulations, and a lot of wide-eyed questions. People asked how I was feeling, if I'd known right away, if we'd started thinking about names. I didn't have answers for half of it. My hands kept drifting to my stomach, flat for now but suddenly full of meaning. What struck me most was how much love existed in that small room. Not loud or performative, but the quiet kind, the kind that shows up with store-bought cupcakes and a goofy onesie wrapped in tissue paper, the kind that stays long enough to wash the dishes and says, "We're here no matter what happens next." Jake held my hand under the table the whole time, rubbing his thumb in little circles, and even though my heart was racing and my brain was a mess of hormones and possibility, for those few hours I felt okay. Maybe even better than okay. I felt like something good was beginning. Jake and I have been together for almost 3 years now, though in some ways it still feels like it's only just beginning. We met during our final year at university, in one of those strange in-between seasons where everything felt like it was simultaneously ending and starting all at once. I was juggling a thesis project, coffee-fueled nights at the library, and the persistent pressure of figuring out what came next, and then there he was, tall, thoughtful, with a laugh that somehow cut through all the stress and made things feel lighter. We were both attending a seminar on urban policy, dry stuff, honestly, and not the kind of setting you'd expect to meet someone who would eventually become this central to your life, but we kept sitting next to each other, kept talking, and soon it became a habit that bled into coffee runs and late-night walks back to our off-campus housing. We clicked in a way that felt effortless but deep, like we'd both been quietly waiting to be seen by someone who would actually understand, not just the version we presented to the world, but the messier, more vulnerable sides too. We dated through finals, graduated, and then stumbled through that awkward post-college phase where we were both trying to make our way in the adult world without quite knowing what we were doing. He found a job in Seattle first, and I stayed behind for a while, working a temp job and visiting on weekends when I could afford the bus fare. Those weekends were the highlight of my month. Cooking together in his tiny kitchen, taking long walks through unfamiliar neighborhoods, just figuring out how to grow around each other. When I found out I was pregnant 4 months ago, I think I stopped breathing for a full minute in the bathroom. The test had barely changed color before my mind was spiraling, and yet, weirdly, I also felt calm. Not certain exactly, but grounded in a strange way. I told Jake that same night, sitting cross-legged on his bed with the words trembling out of me like a confession. He didn't freak out. He didn't run. He just reached for my hand and held it, and in that moment I knew I had to move in with him. Not just for practicality or finances or logistics, though those things mattered too, but because I wanted to be near him. Because the thought of facing whatever came next without Jake didn't make sense to me. So I packed my things over the next few weeks, said goodbye to my little studio, and moved into his apartment in the city. It wasn't dramatic or full of fanfare, just a decision made with quiet conviction, like the next page in a story that had already been unfolding for years. At first, I was terrified in a way that felt all-consuming, like I'd stepped off a ledge without fully realizing how high up I was. Jake and I had only just started building the fragile outlines of our adult lives. Our careers were still more potential than reality, and most days we were figuring things out on the fly, celebrating tiny wins like getting health insurance or not burning dinner. The idea of adding a baby into that already precarious equation felt overwhelming, like trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing. And it wasn't just the practical stuff, though that definitely kept me up at night. It was the sheer emotional weight of it. Our families knew each other, sure, but in the polite, surface-level way you smile and nod at graduations or holidays, not in the kind of deep, connected way that makes shared milestones easier. Suddenly this pregnancy, shifted everything. It wasn't just about us anymore. It was about generations and expectations and the quiet judgments you can feel even when nothing is said out loud. But in the middle of all that fear, Jake became my anchor. He didn't pretend it wasn't a big deal, he admitted he was scared too, but every time we talked about it, I could feel the same thing echoing between us. We wanted this child. Not out of obligation or panic or pressure, but because somehow, even in our uncertainty, we knew there was something worth holding on to. I remember lying awake next to him one night, staring at the ceiling and whispering, "What if we mess everything up?" And without missing a beat he said, "Then we mess it up together." That was the moment I stopped feeling so alone in it. Yes, the emotions were complicated, a mix of joy and fear and disbelief, but they were shared. And that made all the difference. After countless late-night conversations filled with what-ifs and maybe somedays, Jake and I finally came to a quiet, mutual decision that felt right for us and where we are in life right now. We decided that we would get engaged soon, not because we felt pressured by tradition or anyone else's expectations, but because we wanted to make a commitment to each other that reflected what we already knew in our hearts. This baby, this life we're building, it's all real and unfolding whether we have rings on our fingers or not, but the engagement felt like a way to mark this chapter, to say yes, we are choosing each other intentionally, even in the middle of the chaos. At the same time, we agreed that the actual wedding could wait. Not indefinitely, but until the timing felt more settled, until we've adjusted to being parents, until our finances aren't balancing on a knife's edge and our routines no longer feel like they're built on sand. We wanted to do it right, not perfect, not extravagant, just meaningful and grounded in who we are becoming together. There's something beautiful, I think, in giving ourselves that space, in saying we don't have to do everything all at once. The love is already here, growing alongside the tiny heartbeat we saw on that blurry ultrasound screen. The wedding can come later. Right now, we're focused on this baby, on finding our rhythm, and on standing side by side as we step into this next part of our story. When we finally shared the news with our families, my side was nothing short of thrilled. My parents cried the good kind of tears, the kind that come with tight hugs and whispered prayers, and my siblings immediately started joking about baby names and promising to spoil their future niece or nephew rotten. It felt like stepping into a warm room after being out in the cold, safe, embraced, understood. But the reaction from Jake's side of the family was different. His older sister Michelle and his mother Linda, both of whom had always seemed warm and open with me in the past, shifted almost overnight into something colder, more distant. It wasn't anything they said outright, but everything about them became clipped and formal, like we were acquaintances again instead of soon-to-be family. Michelle, who used to send me funny memes and text me about the latest books we were both reading, stopped responding altogether. Linda, who once insisted I call her by her first name and treated me like one of her own, now barely made eye contact and spoke in carefully measured tones. At first, I told myself I was imagining it, that maybe they were just surprised or overwhelmed. But the chill in the air wasn't subtle, it was unmistakable. Suddenly, every conversation felt like I was walking through a minefield, unsure what might set off an uncomfortable silence or an awkward pause. They hadn't reacted like this when Jake and I first started dating, or even when I moved in with him. It was the pregnancy that changed everything, that much was clear. And while they never said anything overtly cruel, the shift in their demeanor said enough. It hurt more than I expected it to, especially because I had hoped this baby would bring everyone closer, not drive a wedge between us. Jake noticed it too, though he tried to play it down at first, saying they probably just needed time. But even he couldn't ignore how different things had become. And though I tried to keep my focus on the positive, on the new life we were creating, there was a quiet ache in realizing that not everyone who once smiled at me was smiling anymore. A few days after the coldness from Linda and Michelle had really started to sink in, Jake sat me down in the quiet of our apartment, the kind of serious stillness that made my stomach twist before he even said a word. He looked like he'd been carrying something heavy for days, and when he finally spoke, it was slow and careful, like he was trying to choose words that wouldn't hurt, even though I could tell they were going to anyway. He told me that his mother and sister had pulled him aside privately, just the three of them, and said something that made my breath catch in my throat. They believed I had planned the pregnancy on purpose. Not as a joyful accident or a shared decision made out of love, but as a calculated move to gain a foothold in their wealthy family. I remember just staring at Jake, blinking, trying to process what I had just heard. It didn't make sense, not just because it wasn't true, but because these were women who had once welcomed me with warmth, who had laughed with me over dinner and hugged me at birthdays. And now they saw me as some sort of opportunist, someone scheming to trap their son or brother for the sake of status or security. The accusation was so insulting, so far from the truth, it didn't even feel real at first. Jake looked angry, not at me but at them, and I could see how much it hurt him to say it out loud. He said he defended me, told them the pregnancy wasn't planned but it also wasn't unwanted, that we were both scared and surprised but completely on the same page. Still, their words had left a mark. Not just on him but on me too. It was like something cracked quietly beneath the surface, and suddenly I felt like I had to prove myself to people who had already made up their minds. I didn't cry right away. I think I just sat there, numb, thinking about every moment I'd spent with Linda and Michelle, every laugh, every kind gesture, and wondering how long they'd seen me as someone I wasn't. Wondering if they ever truly liked me at all. As if the accusation about the pregnancy being some kind of scheme wasn't enough, a few days later another reason for Michelle's sudden hostility came to light, and this time it was so petty it almost didn't feel real. Jake and I had been tiptoeing around the tension with his family, trying to keep the peace as best we could, when he told me that Michelle had confronted him again, this time livid over something else entirely. She felt that our pregnancy announcement had stolen her moment. Her wedding was scheduled for 3 months from now, and apparently, in her mind, all attention from now until then was supposed to be focused squarely on her. The fact that we were expecting a baby was, in her words, a deliberate distraction, a selfish act of timing that had taken the spotlight off her big day. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. We hadn't even made some grand public announcement, hadn't posted anything online or thrown a big party or done anything beyond quietly telling our families and a few close friends. There wasn't a cake or a banner or even a formal "we're expecting" moment, it was just real life unfolding. But to Michelle it was a betrayal. She felt upstaged, as if our pregnancy was a performance staged purely to compete with her wedding. And the worst part was she wasn't subtle about it. Jake said she used words like tacky and attention-seeking, and even went so far as to suggest we wait until after her wedding to tell people, as if the baby would politely delay its existence out of respect for her timeline. I wanted to laugh and cry at the same time. I couldn't wrap my head around how something so deeply personal, so full of love and fear and hope, had been twisted into a rivalry we never asked for. All we did was share our truth and somehow that became an insult. It made me feel smaller, like no matter what we did, it would be interpreted in the worst possible light by people who had already decided to see me as the villain. It hurt more than I wanted to admit, knowing that Michelle wasn't just indifferent to our news, she was angry about it. Angry that something beautiful in our lives dared to exist at the same time as something beautiful in hers. Jake's family has always lived in a world that feels slightly glossier than mine, and while it was never something that came between us early on, the contrast became more obvious once the pregnancy entered the picture. His family owns a well-established construction company and manages multiple properties, and they've been comfortably wealthy for as long as Jake can remember. Their house is the kind with a perfectly landscaped lawn and a kitchen that looks like it belongs in a magazine, where everything is curated and coordinated, and the wine is always poured into the right kind of glass. My parents, on the other hand, both work in medical administration. Solid, steady jobs that paid the bills and put food on the table, but never came with the kind of luxury or leisure that Jake grew up surrounded by. We're a normal middle-class family, practical and modest, where vacations were road trips and birthday dinners meant my mom's pasta and a store-bought cake with lopsided candles. Growing up, I never felt like I lacked anything important, but being around Jake's family has sometimes made me feel like I need to explain myself, like I have to prove that I belong in a room that was never built with me in mind. They don't say it directly, but there's an undercurrent of judgment, a subtle tightening of smiles, a quiet comparison between their polished world and my simpler one. It's not just about money, it's about how they carry themselves, how they expect things to be done, how they talk about people without realizing how it sounds to someone like me. I used to think we could blend those two worlds, that love would be enough to bridge the gap. But lately, it feels like my background has become just another strike against me in their eyes, another reason to question my intentions, another reason to doubt that I could possibly be good enough for their son. After everything, the cold glances, the whispered accusations, the passive-aggressive comments disguised as concern, I think the only reason we didn't cut off contact with Jake's family entirely was because of his father, Greg. He was the one steady, unwavering presence in the middle of all the tension, the only one who still looked at me with warmth in his eyes and didn't treat my pregnancy like some scandalous inconvenience. From the very beginning, Greg had been supportive in a quiet but meaningful way, always making sure to include me in conversations, asking how I was feeling and actually listening when I answered. He never pushed too hard, but he always made it clear without saying too much that he was on our side. When things started spiraling, when Linda's tone grew sharper and Michelle's snide remarks started slipping into every interaction, it was Greg who pulled Jake aside and asked us not to escalate anything. He said he understood why we were upset, and that he didn't agree with how they were treating me, but he gently asked if we could just keep the peace until Michelle's wedding was over. He wasn't asking us to pretend everything was fine, just to avoid turning the whole thing into a family war right before such a big event. I could tell it wasn't easy for him. He was stuck in the middle, trying to protect his daughter's wedding plans while also standing by us. But there was something about the way he asked, the quiet sincerity in his voice that made me pause. So we kept showing up, biting our tongues and smiling through gritted teeth, not because we forgave or forgot the things that had been said, but because Greg had asked with such genuine care. We saw him trying even when the rest of the family seemed determined to make me feel like an outsider, and that effort meant something. It didn't erase the insults, but it gave us just enough reason to stay civil, for now. It happened during what was supposed to be one of the most meaningful moments of my life, surrounded by the people Jake and I had carefully invited into our home to share in the quiet joy of this unexpected new chapter. The celebration wasn't extravagant, just a small gathering in our apartment with soft music, simple food, and a handful of close friends and family who had been kind enough to show up for us, to offer support and excitement and warmth. The atmosphere had been tender and light, people laughing gently, toasting to the future, asking baby name questions we hadn't even begun to answer. And then Michelle walked up to me holding a glass of champagne and wearing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She looked at the ring Jake had given me only a few days before, the one that wasn't flashy or oversized, but simple and beautiful and filled with meaning, and then without even lowering her voice she said, "Well, at least if Jake never marries you, you can sell the ring and live off the money." Everything stopped. I felt the air leave the room like someone had sucked it out with a vacuum. The chatter went silent, glasses paused midair, and I could feel the eyes of everyone around us landing on me, waiting to see how I would react. For a second I just stared at her, unsure if I'd even heard her right, because the words were so brazen and cruel that they didn't seem real. But she was already turning away, already laughing like it was just another harmless joke, like she hadn't just humiliated me in front of everyone we cared about. I looked at Jake, who looked as stunned as I felt, and then at Greg, whose face had gone pale and tight with anger. I wanted to say something, anything, but my throat had closed up and all I could feel was this aching, burning shame mixed with fury. The ring wasn't just a piece of jewelry, it was the symbol of everything Jake and I had fought to build in the face of judgment and doubt. And she'd reduced me to nothing more than some girl looking to cash in if things didn't work out. It wasn't just a joke. It was a message loud and clear. And even though I stayed composed on the outside, something inside me cracked open right then, the part of me that had been holding on to the hope that maybe, someday, Michelle might see me differently. When the room finally recovered from Michelle's comment and the evening limped awkwardly toward its end, I thought maybe she would pull me aside, maybe offer some kind of half-hearted apology or at least acknowledge that what she said had been inappropriate. But she didn't. Not that night, not the next day. She doubled down, in fact, insisting to Jake that I was overreacting, that it was just a joke, that everyone needed to stop being so sensitive. Jake was furious, but it was Greg who really surprised me. He called Michelle over to his house that weekend, and what was supposed to be a calm conversation turned into something much more serious. He sat her down, looked her straight in the eyes, and told her that if she couldn't treat Jake's fiancée with even the most basic level of respect, then he saw no reason to keep financially supporting her wedding. There was no shouting, no drama in his voice, just a quiet disappointment that somehow cut deeper than any raised voice ever could. Michelle was stunned. She laughed at first, thinking he was bluffing. But when she realized he was serious, that the man who had always bailed her out and made things easier wasn't going to stand by her behavior this time, she exploded. She called it unfair, manipulative, and accused me of poisoning her family against her. She looked right at me across the room and said that I had no place commenting on anything related to her life, and that I should be grateful to even be included in the conversation. That's when I stood up and said very calmly that Greg was right, and that his decision was entirely fair. If she couldn't apologize for publicly insulting me, insulting us, then she didn't deserve the privilege of having him foot the bill for a wedding that clearly mattered more in spectacle than in meaning. What followed was complete chaos. Linda rushed to Michelle's defense, crying and accusing Jake and me of dividing the family. Michelle stormed out, slamming the door and calling her father a traitor, while Greg just sat back down and sighed like a man who had finally dropped a weight he'd been carrying for too long. Jake took my hand under the table and I could feel how tense he was, how much it pained him to watch his family unravel like that. But he didn't waver. Neither did I. We hadn't asked for this war, but we weren't going to keep pretending everything was fine just to keep the peace. The truth was, the peace had been broken long before this moment. This was just the first time someone had the courage to name it. In the aftermath of that disastrous confrontation, Michelle and Linda left in what could only be described as a full-blown scandal, the kind of exit laced with loud voices, slamming doors, and wounded pride on full display. They stormed out of Greg's house with flushed faces and sharp words, making it painfully clear that they viewed themselves as the victims in a situation they had single-handedly created. There was no reconciliation, no moment of clarity or regret, just a flood of indignation and the immediate severing of any remaining civility. After that night, Jake and I made the decision together to cut off all contact with them. We were done. No more pretending, no more walking on eggshells, no more invitations to sit at a table where I was clearly not welcome. The only thread that remained intact was Greg, who stayed in touch with us, quietly supportive and heartbreakingly caught in the crossfire between his children. He still came by now and then, still called to check in, never once asking us to change our minds or reopen the door. He knew it had gone too far. But Michelle and Linda weren't content to let things go. Once they realized we were serious about the silence, the real barrage began. They started bombarding Jake with messages, long texts, voicemails dripping with sarcasm and guilt, emails that oscillated between dramatic accusations and clumsy pleas for him to come to his senses. They accused me of manipulating him, of isolating him from his family, of orchestrating some kind of emotional coup to destroy their tight-knit circle. According to them, I was the problem, the outsider who had wormed her way in and taken everything. Jake read a few of the messages, then stopped. He blocked their numbers and deleted their emails, but not before showing me a few lines that made my stomach turn. One of them even said, "You'll see one day what she really wanted from you." It didn't hurt in the way it used to, it just made me tired. Exhausted by the constant need to defend something as pure and real as our love, our baby, our choice to stand up for ourselves. The irony was they had always warned Jake to watch out for people who wanted to tear the family apart, and in the end they had done that all on their own. We hadn't stolen anything. We just refused to keep pretending. And if that was our crime, then we would live with it, together. One night, not long after we'd finally cut off all contact with Michelle and Linda, Jake and I sat on the couch in the soft, flickering light of the lamp we'd never bothered to replace with something brighter. The apartment was quiet, the kind of quiet that settles in when the fight is over, but the bruises are still fresh. I don't even remember what sparked the conversation. It might have been a glance or the way I sighed too long after a moment of silence, but suddenly he reached for my hand, held it tightly, and said he needed to tell me something he hadn't quite put into words until now. He looked at me with this raw, vulnerable honesty and told me he was proud of me. Not just in the way people toss that phrase around casually, but truly, deeply proud that I had stood up for myself, that I hadn't let myself be reduced or pushed aside, no matter how loud or cruel his family became. He said he had seen everything, every hurt look, every forced smile, every time I bit my tongue to keep the peace, and it broke something in him to realize how much I'd endured just to be accepted by people who had no interest in accepting me. He admitted that, at first, he'd kept hoping things would smooth over, that maybe Michelle and Linda would come around with time. But that hope had eroded slowly, painfully, until all that was left was anger and guilt. He was tired, so tired, of watching me take hit after hit, of trying to balance loyalty to the family he grew up with against the life he was building with me, the woman carrying his child, the woman he loved. He said choosing me didn't feel like turning his back on his family, not really. It felt like finally turning towards something that made sense, something honest, something that wasn't about status or image or control. Still, it hurt him deeply. I could see it in his eyes, that ache of knowing some parts of his past might be forever lost, that the people who were supposed to be happiest for him had turned their backs when he needed them most. But even in the middle of that grief, he said something that will stay with me for the rest of my life. If this is what it takes to protect you, to protect us, then it's worth it. I'll mourn what I've lost, but I won't regret standing beside you. And in that moment, everything that had felt heavy and sharp softened just a little, because even though we had lost something, we still had each other. And that was enough. It had been weeks since the last bitter message, weeks of silence that had settled around us like a blanket we were finally learning to breathe under. Then, out of nowhere, my phone lit up with a call from Linda. I stared at the screen for a long time before I answered, unsure of what kind of version of her I was about to hear, the cold, dismissive one who looked through me like I didn't belong, or the woman who had once offered me homemade tea and asked about my job with polite curiosity. Her voice was quiet, softer than I remembered, and for a long moment she didn't say anything. Then she apologized. Genuinely. She said she'd spent a lot of time thinking, and that she now realized how hurtful her behavior had been. She admitted she had made assumptions that were unfair, had let pride and appearances blind her to what really mattered, and that she was sorry for making what should have been a beautiful moment in our lives so much harder. I didn't say much, Just listened cautiously because I wasn't sure yet if this was truly remorse or just another performance. Then Michelle's voice came through on a second call a few hours later. Her tone was shakier, more defensive at first, but she, too, eventually said the words I never thought I'd hear from her. She said she'd been consumed by stress and jealousy and had projected it all onto me. She admitted that I hadn't deserved the things she said at my celebration, and that she had let her wedding obsession cloud her empathy. She said she knew she'd lost a lot, maybe even permanently, but hoped that with time, things could change. I didn't agree to anything right away. I didn't say it was all forgiven or that we could pretend the past hadn't happened. But I told them both as evenly as I could, that I would tell Jake what they said. That's all I promised, that I would carry their words to him because he deserved to hear them too. Whether or not we moved forward from there would be a conversation for another time. Right now, I needed space to feel it all, to process, to question, to protect the peace we had only just begun to rebuild. Reconciliation was not a door I could fling open without hesitation, not after everything, but it was no longer locked. And maybe that was a start. After a few more conversations and a lot of quiet reflection, Jake and I finally agreed to have dinner with Linda and Michelle. It wasn't an easy decision. It came with a tight knot in my stomach and 1,000 unspoken worries, but something in the way they had reached out, the way they hadn't pushed or demanded forgiveness, made me believe it was worth at least sitting down together. That night, they showed up early and empty-handed, which somehow made the moment feel more honest. There were no grand gestures, no performative gifts, just two women who looked more human than I had ever seen them, nervous and remorseful and, above all, sincere. They apologized again, this time face-to-face with no justifications or excuses. Linda admitted she had been afraid of change, afraid of losing the son she thought she knew, and that fear had turned into judgment. Michelle confessed that she had felt overlooked in her own life and lashed out at the first thing that made her feel less important. Hearing them say these things, not defensively but with real vulnerability, loosened something that had been coiled tight inside me for months. I didn't cry. I didn't leap into their arms. But I nodded. And slowly the tension began to shift. From that night on, things started to change. It wasn't immediate or perfect, but it was real. They began helping in small ways, offering rides to appointments, picking up baby clothes, texting to ask if I needed anything. Michelle surprised me once with a book on newborn care and a box of herbal tea she said helped her friend during postpartum recovery. Linda came over with dinner one evening and ended up folding laundry with me in companionable silence. It felt surreal, like watching people rebuild a bridge that had once been set on fire. When our daughter was finally born, something incredible happened. Both families came together, not just in the same room but truly present for each other. There were tears, laughter, way too many photos, and for once, no undercurrents of resentment. Just this shared love for a tiny, perfect human who had unknowingly stitched us all together. Greg held her with tears in his eyes. Linda kissed my forehead and told me I was brave. Michelle, to my surprise, offered to stay the night and help with feeding so I could sleep a little. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. There are still scars, memories of words that cut too deep and silences that lasted too long, but we made it through. We became a family. A real, messy, imperfect, deeply human family. And standing in that hospital room, watching Jake rock our daughter under the soft light of morning, I realized something I hadn't dared to hope for months ago. Sometimes broken things don't go back to how they were. Sometimes they come back stronger. Different, but stronger. And that was enough.